is sharing the load, passing the ball, understanding that all of us together are smarter than any one of us alone. And that worked. The verdict has been written. This is not the end. In the coming weeks, the court will determine sentencing, and later this summer, we will not be talking about that. This verdict reminds us how hard it is to make enduring change. And I just want to finish by sharing some important historical legacy, if you allow me. In 1968, the Kerner Commission was formed to investigate the causes of uprisings across major American cities. And a man named Dr. Kenneth Clark, a famous African-American psychologist, who, along with his equally accomplished psychologist wife, Mamie, contributed to compelling research in the Brown versus Board of Education case. And Dr. Clark testified at the Kerner Commission. And I want to quote you what he said. I read that report, the one in the 1919 riot in Chicago, and it was if I were reading the report of investigating the committee of the Harlem riot in 1935, the report on investigating the Harlem riot in 1943, and the report of the McCone Commission on the Watts riot. I must say again in candor to you, the members of this commission, it's like a kind of an Alice in Wonderland with the same movie picture reshown over and over again, the same analysis, the same recommendation, and the same inaction. Those are the words of Dr. Clark in 1968. Here we are in 2020, 2021. Here we are in 2021, still addressing the same problem. Since Dr. Clark testified, we have seen Rodney King, Abner Louima, Oscar Grant, Eric Garner, Michael Brown, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, Stephon Clark, Atiana Jefferson, Anton Black, Breonna, and now Dante Wright and Adam Toledo. This has to end. We need true justice. That's not one case. That is a social transformation that says that nobody's beneath the law and no one is above it. This verdict reminds us that we must make enduring systemic societal change. More than a month ago, months before George Floyd was murdered, the Minnesota Public Safety Commissioner John Harrington and I released the recommendations of our working group on reducing deadly force encounters with law enforcement. What all of us in that working group, including law enforcement, wanted is for everyone to go home safe. Anytime someone doesn't, everyone's lives are changed forever. We need to use this verdict as an inflection point. What if we just prevented the problem instead of having to try these cases? We don't want any more community members dying at the hands of law enforcement and their families' lives ruined. We don't want any more law enforcement members having to face criminal charges and their families' lives ruined. We don't want any more communities torn apart. One way to prevent this is to get into a new relationship where we as a society re-examine the use of force and our old settled assumptions. I'm so proud of Chief Arredondo and the Minneapolis police officers who by their testimony said enough is enough. And another way to prevent it is by acknowledging and lifting up everyone's humanity, helping communities heal, and officers be well. Another way to prevent it is with accountability. But they must be more than words on paper, and there must be accountability for violating them. With this verdict, we've brought some accountability. Finally, this verdict demands us to never give up the hope that we can make. Said slavery would never end. Generations said Jim Crow would never end. Generations said women would never be equal to men. Generations said if you were different in any way, you could never be a full and equal member of our society. Today, we have to end this travesty of recurring, enduring deaths at the hands of law enforcement. Those beliefs are things we have to focus our attention on. And as I now do close, I just want to say to you, the work of our generation is to put unaccountable law enforcement behind us. It's time to transform the relationship between community and the people who are sworn to protect them from one that is mistrustful, suspicious, and in some cases terrifying, into one that is empathetic, compassionate, and affirming. That will benefit everyone, including police officers who deserve to serve in a profession that is honored, in departments where they don't have to worry about colleagues who don't follow the rules. Now that work is in your hands. The work of our generation is to put an end of Jim Crow and the centuries of trauma and finally put an end to racism. We can end it to be with us into the future if we decide now to have true liberty and justice for all. The work of our generation is to say goodbye to old practices that don't serve us anymore and to put them all behind us. One conviction, even one like this one can create a powerful new opening to shed old practices and reset relationships. So with that, I just want to say that I do hope that people step forward and understand that nobody can do everything, but everybody can do something. You can do something the way like everyday people like Donald Williams and Genevieve Hanson and Christopher Martin and Charles McMillan and all those teenagers and young people stepped up and did something. You can do things like help pass the George Floyd Justice and Accountability Act. It's in your hands. Let's get the work done. And now I'd like to invite my friend and partner in justice, Michael Freeman, Hennepin County Attorney.
Thank you, Mr. Attorney General.
That was Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison calling the guilty verdicts against Derek Chauvin true accountability. He also said this: nobody can do everything, but we can all do something. And now he's calling on all of us to do something. He said it's never too late, that you can always bring enduring change. Never give up on that. We want to bring in Ibram Kendi. He's a CBS News contributor and lead anti-racist scholar. Ibram, I thought it was interesting what Attorney General Ellison said. He said, we did not get justice yet, but we did get accountability, and now let's get to work on getting the justice. What did you make of that?
I'm glad he pointed that out, because certainly one case does not solve, all problems, but it certainly is holding Derek Chauvin accountable for murdering George Floyd, and hopefully it will cause other police officers to think twice before they engage in lethal force.
He talked about the 1968 Kerner Commission that Dr. Kenneth Clark contributed to, that we are still addressing the same problem back then in 1968. We are still dealing with those same problems of racial injustice in 2021, Ibram.
And I think that I was inspired certainly by Keith Ellison's message that despite how long racism has lived in this country, despite how long police brutality has harmed people in this country, we still as a nation can bring about its end, and we should be focused on bringing about its end, because so many families, even during the Chauvin trial, I saw one report that found that more than 3 people per day were killed at the hands of law enforcement during the Chauvin trial. So this is a huge problem, and we need major solutions to solve this huge problem.
Yeah, I realize I took Keith Ellison's point. There is still so much work to be done. But I think we should just take a moment and really talk about how difficult it is to get not 1, not 2, but 3 convictions in this particular case against a police officer, a former police officer. That just does not happen. So shouldn't there be some way of celebrating and acknowledging and for people to savor that victory at this particular time?
I do think that is the case. And Gail, I can tell you that when he was found guilty on all three charges, as somebody who studied the long history of racism in this country, as someone who has chronicled the history of police brutality, in this country, I was shocked. I was. There's been other extremely well documented cases of police brutality and violence in which the officer was not held accountable. So I was shocked. I'm hoping that we can get to a point in this nation where none of us are shocked when an officer is held accountable.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people are happy and shocked, but the bigger question is, what can we do to make sure we don't get to this point again? Thank you very much, Ibram Kendi. Thank you. Nora?
Gail, thank you. And we should update. We are learning that President Biden and Vice President Harris have called the Floyd family after the guilty verdict. The Floyd family attorney, Benjamin Crump, tweeting out thank you to POTUS and Vice, and then saying, we hope we can count on you for the we need in. Let's bring in Michael Eric Dyson, a distinguished university professor of African American Studies at Vanderbilt University, and he joins us. And Michael, so good to see you. And it was interesting to hear Minnesota's Attorney General Keith Ellison say, this is not just about justice, it's about, instead, accountability. This is finally an instance of accountability.
No, it's great to see you as well, Nora. And it's extremely important to talk about the distinction between accountability. Holding a police person who has acted and misbehaved in such a heinous fashion that he deprived regard for that man's life. In my book that I just wrote about Long Time Coming, Reckoning with Race in America, I have an entire chapter on George Floyd, speaking about George Floyd and the way in which the knee of Derek Chauvin bore mercilessly into the neck of George Floyd, which is a metaphor for how so often the dominant culture has bore its knee into the necks of black people. And when we die, when we perish, when there is a loss of life, I think Attorney General Ellison is correct. This is not justice, because justice would be the full restoration of that man's life, and we know that is impossible to occur. Justice would be preventing this lethal possibility of occurring in the first place, and preventing cops through a system that supports their acts of terror to engage in behavior without being held to account. So accountability is critical. Justice will be when we have a potential in this society to prevent this kind of thing from happening routinely and ever to African American, to Latino, and anybody for that matter who's a citizen in this nation.
The Attorney General is saying we need societal transformation, enduring societal systemic change. That can't be achieved just through the justice system. It has to be achieved legislatively, not only in Congress, but the type of police reform that takes years and years to more hopeful, given what's happened after the past year.
Hopeful, yes, not optimistic at all. Reinhold Niebuhr, the great theologian, made a distinction between optimism and hope. Optimism is a shallow virtue. You put your finger in the air to determine which way the wind is blowing. Hope says, even against the evidence, you manifest the ability to believe, to imagine, to conjure a future possibility where justice will prevail. So in that sense, I'm extremely hopeful. But we live in a society where 43 state legislatures right now are preparing bills, about 100 or 200 bills, that try to reject the possibility of black people and others voting. The temper of the times is set against progressive realization of the goals and aspirations of the civil rights movement and the fundamental justice for black people in this nation. So we have a pitched battle ahead of us, not impossible to win, but difficult to win. So we've got to get together and make certain that we galvanize the potential of resistance that is afoot in this country now to make that justice come into a reality. And as you said, Nora, it's not simply about police reform. It's about systems. It's about ways of thought. It's about worldviews. It's about perspectives. It's about deeply ingrained. It's about unconscious bigotry. All these addressed if we are to have real justice and real change and transformation in this culture.
Michael Eric Dyson, always good to have you. Thank you. A programming note that some of you will be leaving us for your local news. For the rest of you, our coverage continues here on CBS News as we continue to cover the reaction in the streets of Minneapolis, and we're waiting to hear from the family of George Floyd and their reaction. They've been speaking with the president and vice president. We are expecting to hear from them. Gail?
Thanks, Dawn. You know, right now, hear from the family of George Floyd. We also want to hear from a juror, but I thought it was very interesting that the judge says, you know, if the jurors want their privacy, please give them that. And I said, Jamie, did the jurors say that they want privacy? In that jury room, I wanted to talk. You have been in contact with the poll reporter. We know that they've taken 10 hours, 4 last night to deliberate, 6 today. We don't know if they stopped for lunch, but let's say a total of 10. And Derek Chauvin gave no reaction whatsoever when the verdict was read, about 4:06 here in Minneapolis, 5:06 on the East Coast. Have you heard, what have you heard about the reaction from the jury when the verdict was read?
So this is really interesting, right? This trial has been fascinating on so many levels. Because of COVID, there's only one print reporter and one broadcast reporter allowed in, and that's what was allowed in during the reading of the verdict. So the pool reporter who was in there says that when the verdict was read, the jury was almost silent. There was no reaction from any of the members of the jury, which is really interesting because as we've been talking about when I was inside the courtroom, I noticed all these little moments with the jurors of how intense they were on writing their notes, how engaged they were at looking at the witnesses and looking at the attorneys in the courtroom. These were very animated jurors who really were engaged and then sat silent as the verdict was read.
So it almost sounds like they made a decision amongst themselves. We're going to go out. We're going to sit in our seats. We're not going to show anything. I would just think as a defendant, you're just looking for any signs as they're walking in the room to see, do they make eye contact? What does that mean? And you said nothing.
Well, what's been interesting about this case too, Gail, and the reason a lot of people talked about Derek Chauvin taking his mask off when his defense closing arguments began is because of COVID again, everyone's wearing a mask. So it's easier to hide your emotions, right, and hide your humanity behind that a little bit because all you're getting are the eye
Your eyes sticking out. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm also curious about inside the courtroom because I kept hearing that there were, as you said, just the print and the broadcast. But for the Derek Chauvin and the George Floyd family, each could have one person in the courtroom. And I have heard that every day there was someone in there for the Floyd family.
Absolutely.
And I heard for the first couple of weeks at least, there was nobody there for Derek Chauvin.
Yeah,
Did you hear that too?
Yes, and it was interesting because the day I was there and inside the courtroom, an older white woman showed up. She would not give her name, and when we tried to speak to her, she would turn toward the wall. She did not want to be identified in any way, but she did sit in the family seat for Derek Chauvin. Now, we don't know if she was a family member, if she was a friend, she was just some type of supporter, but when you were in the courtroom, because of COVID protocols, again, you had George Floyd's family member who was in there every day. As you said, there were multiple family members who came to support the prosecution. Then you would have a deputy, and then for the last few days of this trial, you had someone in Derek Chauvin's support seat. But it was very jarring to look over, and they're just feet apart from each other.
Yeah.
So the social distancing was happening, but it was jarring because, you know, in a normal courtroom, this side is this side, that side is that side, and it's pretty clear who's on what side. These two are in one corner of the room together with a deputy in between.
I was fascinated too by Derek Chauvin because he spent the whole time writing something. Do you know, I mean, he was nonstop writing. Do you happen to know what he was writing, what he was doing?
So where I sat, Eric Nelson was directly in front
His
of
attorney,
me.
yes.
His attorney, the defense. And then Derek Chauvin was just to the left. I don't have the best eyesight. I put on my glasses to see
Yes.
what he was doing. It seemed like he was writing cursive sentences or writing very quickly handwritten notes to himself. He was writing. I was seeing, was he doodling? What was he doing? I talked to a number of attorneys in town who told me that this can be a defense tactic because if they feel that their client isn't going to come off in the best manner to the jury, that this is a way to get him engaged in writing notes and looking like he's doing something else. So he's not being intense to the jury members. He's not making eye contact with them or any of the witnesses.
Okay, Jamie, I'm going to have to cut you off for a second because we see George Floyd's family is about to speak. They're represented by civil rights attorney Benjamin Crump. It looks like, I think I saw Al Sharpton in that shot as well. At the podium. Al Sharpton is there. Jamie, my eyesight is bad too, but I could have sworn I saw him in a tight shot. But let's listen into what they're saying. Says man George Floyd.
Before we say anything, we're going to have a prayer. When we first came to make and went to the site, when Ben Crump called, we remembered how Eric Garner said, "I can't breathe" 11 times. His mother came with us to the site. The family came in, and this family has stood together last 11 months, watching this video go over and over. This family stood with pain, suffering, and not knowing what the future held, because so many families went and got nothing. They thanked God when they got the indictment, which would not have happened had not the Attorney General Keith Ellison took this case. And Keith Ellison fought and put together a team that made this possible. And this is the first time in the history of this state that a white police officer has been convicted, less known convicted of a murder. This is the first time in a long array of fights that we've seen 3 counts, guilty in all 3. We don't find pleasure in this. We don't celebrate a man going to jail. We would have rather George be alive. But we celebrate that we, because young people, white and black, some castigated, many that are here tonight, marched and kept marching and kept going. Many of them looked down on, but they kept marching and wouldn't let this die. And this is an assurance to them that if we don't give up, that we can win some rounds. But the war and the fight is not over. Just 2 days from now, we're going to have to deal with the funeral of Dante Wright in the same county, the same area. We still have cases to fight, but this gives us the energy to fight on. And we are determined that we're going to fight until we make federal law the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act must be law. We want to thank all that were involved, especially the Attorney General and the governor and others. We want to thank President Biden, who the first time he came out of his house during the campaign, he flew to Houston and met with the family and Attorney Crump and I. And he sat there, and I will never forget, he said to George's daughter that I heard you say your father is going to change the world. Well, we can now tell George's daughter she was right. Her father has begun the changing of the world for real. But before we do anything, we first want to pray and thank God, because somehow God made a way. He had mercy. We believe in a God that can even get through the cracks in the jury room and bring conscience and bring truth. And that jury, we want to thank them for letting God give them the strength wherever they are tonight. We want them to know we broke down in tears when we heard the verdict. We had to hold each other and hug in tears because too many nights we've cried. Many of us for decades spent nights in jail. But today we can wipe our tears away and fight on for another day. There's sunlight. We're going to keep going till we bring it for the Eric Garners and the Breonna Taylors, whose boyfriend is here tonight. Sean Bell, so many that did not get this night. This night is for them. Let us pray. Let's lock arms and pray like we kin folks. Come on, Brad. Where's Malone? Yeah, come on. You and Rodney come up front. You know he's hiding now. Brother Chris, get next to the Attorney General there. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for giving us the strength to stand together. Sometimes we would question each other. Sometimes we say this is just going to be a waste of time. But somehow you touch us in the midnight hours and teach us to hold on. And that if we would be faithful over a few things, you'd give us the victory over many. We thank you because we know it was not any doing of ours, but your loving kindness and your tender mercy that made tonight possible. Bless those that worked, that made this prosecution something they couldn't deny. Bless those policemen that got on the stand and testified against another policeman. Bless the jury that listened to the evidence and didn't listen to those that may criticize them for doing this. Bless the prosecutor, Keith Ellison, and his staff that did their job, even though they didn't know what the outcome would be. Bless Ben Crump in a special way, that worked tirelessly, that jumped on planes and left his family to make sure that justice would rain down. Thank you for all of the civil and human rights leaders that stood up. And we thank you for the nameless grandmas and grandpas that will get on their knees and ask you to give us a victory this time. And Lord, as we give you the thanks and give you the praise, let George know that his name is going down in history. They may have put their knee on his neck, but he will now be a figure that we will take the knees off our necks now, and we give you the praise. Thank you. And God, we give you the glory. These blessings we ask in your name. Amen. 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 Let me say that I want to bring on now who is sent to fight for justice. He didn't seek the role, but he rose to the occasion. America, for many years, didn't have someone to stand for us. The last 4 years, we didn't have an Attorney General's office that would even hear our cry. But we had been raised to believe that God always has a ram in the bush. And God has a way of taking the most humble of people and raising them up. We had an Attorney General in Black America that has represented these cases with the acumen and skill of one that was raised in the South but came to claim this nation in a direction. I bring you the Attorney General for Black America, Ben Crump.